Now, this lesson is focusing mainly on the Renaissance period. Now, we've done plenty of lessons already on the Renaissance period. But what this is going to do, we've looked at communication and what people thought caused disease. What this lesson is going to do is start getting us to think about treatment and prevention. And within that, we're going to also look at hospitals, medics, and then also the basic treatment and prevention. And within it, we've got to understand continuity and change. We've got to understand what stayed the same in this period, but also what continued. What was different. So the point of this lesson is we're going to go back over treatment and prevention from the medieval period. Look at the continuity and change. Now, there's a reason for this. The first question in the exam, paper 1, Medicine Through Time, is about comparing time periods. Now, what's really important is that people get the correct time period. The biggest error that I've seen in the past is people who talk about Renaissance when they should be talking about medieval, or talking about modern when they're should be talking about industrial. So knowing your time periods is absolutely vital. Knowing that, Galen isn't in the modern period is very important. So what we're going to look at over this lesson is looking at the treatment, prevention, medics, and hospitals in the Renaissance period, and look at what was the same and what was different, which will allow you in turn to do a 4-mark exam question on this. So, treatment in the Renaissance period. I'm going to go through I'm going to go through this with a highlighter, and I'll read it first, and then I'm going to go through what is continuity and what could be changed. So, since belief in humoral imbalances persisted through to the end of the 17th century and beyond, the old treatments, which were aimed at rebalancing humours, continued as well. Right, so let's say change is going to be red, continuity is going to be green. First of all, what we need to understand is that humoral treatments, oh, that is dreadful highlighting. Let me just try that again. So, let's say continuity is going to be green, change is going to be red, continuity. Where it says the ideas about humoral imbalance continued, the old treatments which were aimed at rebalancing the humours stayed the same, that's going to be continuity. The fact that people were still bleeding, so that's supposed to be green, the fact that people were still bleeding, purging and sweating shows that some elements of treatment were still the same, and it was based around the concept of your humours being in balance. So in the Renaissance period, people still continued to balance their humours by using bleeding, purging and sweating. So remember, with bleeding you had things like leeching, cutting a vein and cupping, and in terms of purging you had emetics, laxatives and the clyster. And sweating, mainly with sweating you'd have the bathing, and you'd also bathe in herbs. So that was continuity in the Renaissance period. It's important that we understand that things did still stay the same. They can't change overnight, especially when people have been using these ideas for so long. A new popular theory in this period was the idea of transference. This is something that changes. For some reason, the colours do not want to go to what I want. Ideas of transference is something that's a change. Now, this meant that an illness or disease could be transferred to something. For example, people believe if you rubbed an ailment, such as a boil, the disease would transfer from you to an object. So, for example, a very famous example is people during the Great Plague using chickens to rub on their boils. So a new idea is transference. The idea that an illness could be treated by being transferred onto another item, e.g. a chicken. That was something that changed in this period. The idea of treatment, the concept of transference. Herbal remedies continue to be popular. Well, this again, straight away, continuity. So make sure that we are, there's parts of continuity and change here. Herbal remedies continue to be popular, although their use changed slightly. So straight away, in this box here, I'm going to add that herbal remedies were still a popular method of treating people. But this one's going to go in both boxes, both continuity and change. It says in 1500 to 1700, often remedies were chosen because of their colour or shape. This is a change, because people began to choose their remedies because of colour or shape. For example, if someone was to have smallpox, one of the symptoms is a red rash. So people would treat it using a red cure, drinking red wine, eating red food, wearing red clothes. So one of the changes in herbal remedies is that people began to treat themselves based on the colour of the symptoms. So for example, smallpox is red. So you would have red wine, you would eat red food, or wear red clothes. That shows that herbal remedies and remedies in itself changed based on what the symptoms were, which links to a degree with Sydenham's ideas. New plants and remedies. Now this is another change with herbal remedies. New plants and remedies also appeared from the New World in America. New remedies that started to appear included sarsaparilla from the New World, which was used to treat the great pox. And I can't say that, it's ipecac. That's the best way to say it. I cannot say that word there, but ipecac was used for dysentery. So, now you probably had a good laugh there that I cannot say that word in the slightest, but that's fine. We all know that I can't say some of these specific words. With this, you can say that herbal remedies were able to develop due to the influence of the New World. New ingredients, such as sarsaparilla from the New World and ipecac. So they would be used for the great pox and dysentery. You also had another significant change in this period, the growth of alchemy. Now, alchemy means chemical treatments, and this lays the modern foundation of chemistry, and it had a massive impact on treatment of disease. It meant that herbal remedies began to include forms of chemicals. So people began to look for chemical cures for diseases instead of relying on herbs and bloodletting. So I'm going to add this change here, alchemy. Chemical treatments. Now remember, this is the Renaissance, so people were looking for change. And in regards to alchemy, people began to use chemical cures to replace herbs and bloodletting. So going on, it says, the new science was known as iatrochemistry. If you remember that in the exam, that'll be impressive. The Pharmacopoeia Londiniensis, published by the College of Physicians in 1618, was a manual of remedies, including chapters on salts, metals, and minerals. So, 1618, surprise, surprise, we had another book written. And again, if you remember this, that's great. If you remember the spelling, that's even more impressive. It was a manual of chemical treatments, which included metals and minerals. And in this book, there were 2,140 remedies, and 122 of them were chemical. This showed that people were going down the route of chemical treatments just that little bit more. One of the most popular ones was antimony. It could be used in small doses to promote sweating. The problem was, I mean, what people did was they left antimony in a cup overnight, and then they would drink the contents. It would encourage vomiting and purging, but it could be dangerous because if you didn't vomit it up quick enough, you have basically just drunk chemicals, so it would kill you very quickly. So that's an overview of treatment. Got to understand that the humoral aspects still remained the same in some places, but there were still aspects of change that people were starting to see. People were starting to think of transference, changing remedies, looking at chemical aspects to develop people's thinking on how treatment would become more effective. Right, now the next thing we're going to look at is prevention. We're going to look at four things today. We looked at the treatment, we're going to look at prevention, medics, and hospitals. So with prevention, instead of doing the colours outside, I'm just going to do the table. So I'll underline key things and then I'll fill the table in as we go. So preventing disease was still seen as the best way to avoid dying from illness. So that's one aspect of continuity. You could argue that people still saw the importance of prevention being the best way to avoid death. Obviously, if you're going to prevent yourself from getting it, you won't die. There was still no certainty. So since treatments had not moved on properly, there was still no certainty that a person would recover. People believed you could avoid disease by practicing moderation in all things, as well as avoiding drafts, exhaustion, rich and fatty foods, too much alcohol, and being lazy. So that is an element of continuity because people were still practicing the regimen sanitatis, which was a list of rules to prevent yourself from getting ill, including moderation, so not too much, not too little, including not being lazy, so moderate exercise, including not too much alcohol, including avoiding stress. All of these things were things that people still practiced in the Renaissance to be able to ensure that they weren't getting sick. Cleanliness was also still important. Remember, in the medieval period, cleanliness was next to godliness. So cleanliness was a key indicator of preventing illness. So keeping clean was still important to preventing illness. And we'll look at this in a minute, but I'm just going to say there's still some links to religion. And remember, cleanliness is next to godliness. Now, there is some change here. Bathing had become a lot less fashionable. So in terms of preventing, bathing became less fashionable. The reason for this was because of syphilis. And what people noticed is that people who visited public baths or stews would catch syphilis. So there was that concept of being able to prevent this. There was this concept that syphilis was being spread, because of public bathing. But actually, this wasn't the case. The reason why people were catching syphilis in public baths was because they were also used as brothels. So people were having unprotected sex within the public baths. So this would lead to it spreading, not the public bathing. But public bathing got the blame. So Henry VIII actually closed public baths, which means they became less fashionable and people didn't use them as often. Now, people in the 16th and 17th centuries were far more likely to keep themselves clean, by rubbing themselves down with linen and changing their clothes regularly. So this is an aspect that was a bit more of a change. People focused on keeping their clothes cleaner and wiping themselves down with linen. There was more focus on personal hygiene. That was important. Rather than just going to public baths and hoping that would work, there was definitely more focus on public hygiene, personal hygiene. People continued to avoid catching disease by practicing the regimen sanitatis, but one difference with this, one change, was that people began to prevent illness by changing their surroundings. So with change, you could say that one prevention method was by changing your surroundings. So people sometimes moved to avoid illness. So if there was an epidemic going around, people might move to try and avoid it. The idea that certain weather conditions or the surrounding atmosphere spread disease was becoming more popular. So the weather was a new, more popular idea in terms of spreading the disease. So people used barometers and thermometers to prevent illness by making links between weather and outbreak of diseases. So people started to take more caution in certain weather conditions. So they used things like thermometers, etc., to develop a way of preventing. More steps were taken to remove miasmata, toxic air. Homeowners in English towns were fined for not cleaning their streets. Now this was different as well. So there was more focus on removing toxic air, the miasmata, including fining people for not cleaning outside of their home. Also, drains were cleaned out, and so were bogs. Now, removing this waste was done by criminals as a form of punishment. So with prevention, it is quite difficult to get a head round to an extent, but there was some subtle changes. People started to link the weather to preventative methods. Bathing became a lot less popular because of the spread of syphilis. And you could say that people began to focus more on cleaning, having more action in their own hands, so outside their own homes. And in terms of keeping swamps clean, it wasn't, you could argue that public health went up a tiny bit, but not a huge amount. Public health had a big focus in the industrial period, but in the Renaissance period, there was an element of change with this aspect. But prevention's probably definitely, I think personally, the most difficult one to keep our heads around. It's very difficult to think of continuity and change with this period because the changes are very, very subtle. Medics is the next one. Now, a medic is someone who treats you, and we're going to look at apothecaries and surgeons and physicians. So apothecaries continued to mix remedies, which is exactly what they did in the medieval period, which is positive, and surgeons continued to carry out simple operations. So in terms of continuity, I'm just going to put I'm going to put apoth, continue to mix remedies. Surgeons continue to do small surgeries. Remember, physicians couldn't do this because they couldn't cut the body because of the religious aspect. Apothecaries were organised into a guild system in the period 1250 to 1500. It meant that men would carry out apprenticeships and then spend several years as a journeyman. So apothecaries was a job where you had to train up. Now, the change. This is a big change here. For both apothecaries and surgeons, education increased significantly in this time period. This was because of war. More war equals more wounds to deal with. So people needed to have more specialism. So surgeons had to get used to new types of injuries, and they needed to have the education to be aware of this. So it could be argued that surgeons became slightly more skillful in this period. Apothecaries had to get used to the changes that alchemy brought. So it says there, the introduction of electrochemistry introduced new ingredients into the stores of apothecaries. That's important. So apothecaries had to get used to the changes that iatrochemistry brought. And the most important thing is that both surgeons and apothecaries needed a license to be able to practice their trade. It makes it safer and shows that they cannot get a license without being more skilled. So there were some changes, definitely, in terms of the apothecaries and the surgeons. Physicians. Physicians continued to be trained at university, so that's good. I'll just put that in continuity. Physicians continue to be trained at university. It says there most learning was still from books, so you could say most, that is definitely continuity, was still from books, which might prevent their ideas. Remember, most books were being, had Galen's ideas, but in terms of changes, we'll talk about in a minute, there was more focus on, or the printing press had more of an impact. Lectures were dictated in Latin, however, now there's going to be a change here. New ideas about the human anatomy and alchemy were shared, which meant that more physicians were challenging old ideas. They wanted to investigate for themselves, which was really important as it meant that there was more freedom within the career and more positive changes could occur because physicians were now getting actively involved in change. However, there was still very little practical hands-on training, so continuity. You could say that physicians still did not do hands-on training as it was difficult to get hold of fresh corpses. And then trainee doctors had much better access to medical textbooks. This is going to be a change, is that trainee physicians had more access to books due to the printing press, which means that their ideas were not going to be hampered by the conservative nature of the church. And also, I mean, the fact is that these physicians could now have more freedom, in expressing their ideas. So there were some significant changes. And one thing you'll notice in the next slide is that physicians were also present in hospital as well. So medics in the Renaissance period, there were still some similarities, but there was quite a significant aspect of change with medics in the Renaissance period. And the last one we've got here, hospitals. Some changes began to take place by the early 16th century. So more people were allowed to go to hospital. They were less hospitality, so they became more focused on treatment. More people were allowed in them. And you could, the religious aspect of hospitals was beginning to change. It suggests that more people went in. This is on the change part. More people went in with wounds, fevers, and skin conditions. So it was no longer just a place to rest. You could also, there was more focus on diet. You had visits from a physician, which was important, and you had medication. So for the first time, hospitals had apothecaries on site to mix remedies for the patient. But another big change was that after the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536, Henry VIII closed a large number of hospitals in England. There was a lot less treatment facilities for people in the country. This led to significant change because of the number. Another thing is that hospitals were able to specialise in certain illnesses, and there were specific hospitals set up for certain illnesses, such as pest houses, who would deal with the plague. This would obviously really help control the spread of illness if it was a specific epidemic. The one continuity with this, even though there was lots of change, most people still decided to be treated at home. So wise women was still very important to treating people. They had more trust. And because of this, there were the older methods being used. For example, purging, bloodletting. And realistically, wise women were a lot cheaper still. Whereas apothecaries, physicians, they were quite expensive because they were licensed, and people still felt like they would trust the wise woman home treatment a lot more. So this could be a question you do. Explain one difference in hospitals from the years 1250 to 1500 to 1500 to 1700. In the years 1250 to 1500, hospitals were. This meant that. However, one change were. This meant that. If you give that question a go, really develop your idea of how things changed and continued. And this is a big chunk of the Renaissance unit that we've just covered.